Alrighty, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Zeke-ollege Football. And I'm so glad to be here with you on this wonderful Tuesday. If you are not listening to this on a Tuesday, disregard that first part. But for those of you who are listening live, thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm excited because this episode we're talking about a conference that historically is always very interesting. No matter what happens, the Big 12 always has something that is worth talking about. And this year is no different. The Big 12 certainly has a lot of storylines going into it, and I'm excited to break those down here today. Let's start off with some background information. Big 12, it's going to look a little different than it has in years past. Two of the figureheads of the conference are gone. Texas and Oklahoma, two of the biggest name schools in the Big 12, they're out of here. They're heading to the SEC. But the Big 12 was preparing for this. They've revamped their image over the past 2 years and have added a total of 8 new schools over that span. So they just last year added BYU, UCF, Cincinnati, and Houston. And then this year they're bringing in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State. So some pretty talented schools. I'll tell you what, this is going to be a fantastic college basketball conference. In terms of college football, it does still sort of settle into that number 3 role or fighting for that number 3 role with the ACC. I do believe that the Big 12 does have that edge over the ACC in that regard. But it's certainly not going to be a Big 10 or an SEC. That being said, a lot to talk about, so we might as well just barrel on through and get into these previews. And there's no better place to start than over in Arizona. Arizona, one of those schools that was affected by the retiring of Nick Saban in a way that it wasn't initially expected. So Nick Saban, longtime Alabama head coach, he retires. Kalen DeBoer, the Washington head coach, comes over to fill the Alabama job. Now who's going to be the Washington head coach? And Arizona, who had a breakout season last year, all of a sudden, their coach, Jedd Fisch, leaves for Washington. So now Arizona's sort of scrambling. They're like, who are we going to get for our head coach? They grab Brent Brennan from San Jose State. So it's going to be year 1 for Brent Brennan. They went 10-3 last year. And a good chunk of the defense is going to follow Jedd Fisch over to Washington. Whenever your coach leaves, there's always a significant amount of players, for the most part, that will transfer over with the head coach. They like him. They're recruited by him. They're going to stay consistent with that head coach. That being said, 2 big players for Arizona on the offensive side are staying put. Noah Fifita, the quarterback sensation who came in for Jayden de Laura last year and led them to a lot of success. And then, and bear with me because it's a tougher name to pronounce, Tetairoa McMillan, his star wide receiver, also back. So your star quarterback, your star wide receiver are both back. And then Jonah Coleman, the running back from last year, he's going to be staying there. And they add another piece, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, coming over from the New Mexico Lobos. So it should be a great offense. Defense is where Arizona might have a little bit of inconsistency, but we'll have to sort of wait and see on that. Now for Arizona State, it's year two for Kenny Dillingham. They went 3-9 last year. Um, but the big story of last season for Arizona State is injuries. This roster had 31 players miss some time with injuries. Uh, that's a lot, and it's hard to win when you have that happen. So really, an admirable performance by Kenny Dillingham in year one. Jaden Rashada, very talented quarterback, highly touted. He was initially going to go to Florida. He signed a letter of intent to commit to Florida, decided to flip that over to Arizona State. He's going to be back for year two, although he didn't play in enough games for that to really count as a freshman year. So he was able to use a red shirt for year one. So he still has 4 years of eligibility left, which is great for Arizona State. They're hoping that he could be their franchise guy and really take this program to new heights. And their main additions in the portal was really in the trenches, focusing on the offensive line, the defensive line. And it makes sense. If you have a franchise guy or someone you believe is the franchise guy, you got to protect them. And defensive line was one of the needs that they needed to work on from last year. So I like what they're doing in the portal. I would expect a better year, but they need to stay healthy if they want to compete. Coming up next, we got Baylor. So it's year 5 now for Dave Aranda. It feels like just yesterday that he started his tenure over with the Baylor Bears. Very disappointing season last year, 3-9. So no surprise, Dave Aranda is going to be on the hot seat going into this season. You can't have a 3-9 season and expect to, just keep your job year after year. There's got to be some change. And part of that was, I'm not going to pin it all on quarterback play. Blake Shapen was fine, but that's all he was. He was just okay. He was just fine. And he didn't really have that X factor to push the team towards victory. So they're bringing in someone who I think does have that X factor, DeQuan Finn from Toledo. Now, if you recall back in the MAC preview episode, Toledo is one of those schools that really recruits over where they're expected to. They're a very, very good school in terms of getting highly touted or like higher touted players and making the most of them. They're a constant powerhouse in the MAC. And DeQuan Finn was one of the reasons why Toledo was actually MAC champions back in 2022. That being said, some players are going to have to step up. And one of those players who I think can step up is their wide receiver, Monterey Baldwin. He's quick, very quick. And with a stronger armed quarterback like DeQuan Finn, I think that he has a chance to really cement himself as one of the better wide receiver options in the Big 12. Now, let's move on to BYU. It's year 9 now for Kalani Sitake. He went 5-7 last year, missed a bowl game for the first time in a couple of years. I'll be honest, I'm not too high on the quarterback options for BYU. Now, granted, last year's quarterback options were not great either, but it's one of those situations where it's great if you can make the most out of not a lot, but you shouldn't have to. They had Keaton Slovis, who was okay at best. Jake Retzlaff, nothing too special there either. And then the quarterbacks that they brought in the portal, Trayson Bourget, brother of Trenton Bourget, who played some time for Arizona State last year. Trayson coming over from Western Michigan. He's all right, but he's not one of those players who I'm excited about, who I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. They got Trayson Bourget. It's not gonna. That doesn't really push the needle a lot for me. And then Gary Bohannon, who's bounced around. He started at Baylor, went to USF. Bohannon is like a seventh year player now, and he just hasn't found a spot, hasn't found a role really on most teams. Now, one thing that they are staying consistent with is receiving threats. Most of them are back. Chase Roberts is back. Cody Epps is back. Isaac Rex is back. So they should be relatively consistent there. I just don't like the quarterback play. And I don't know that they'll be able to get over that hump in the Big 12, especially when more talent is coming in. Now let's talk about UCF. It's year 4 for Gus Malzahn now over at UCF, former Auburn head coach. Won the national championship with Auburn back in 2000 and no, correction. Won the SEC championship with Auburn back in 2013. They lost in the national championship game to Florida State. So let's talk about Gus. They went 6-7 last year, and really the biggest thing that they needed to work on in the offseason was getting a quarterback. John Rice Plumlee graduating, so they had to fill in that role somehow. And they get a pretty highly touted quarterback in the portal, or at least who I view as a pretty good quarterback in the portal, KJ Jefferson from Arkansas. So, a good player over at Arkansas, but my biggest worry about UCF is their receiving core. A lot of their receivers, top receivers, graduating, and then in the transfer portal, they got a couple like tight ends, but not any wideouts. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they switch up their scheme, go more of a heavy package, more tight ends on the fields, emphasize the run game. I'm not sure what they'll do, but what I do know is, they're going to have a lot of receivers on their roster who haven't had a lot of playing time who need to step up. Now let's talk about Cincinnati. Where to start? It's year 2 for Scott Satterfield. They went 3-9 last year. Brendan Sorsby from Indiana is coming over to play quarterback. And this is just it's another receiving core that's going to be very thin. A lot of their top players graduating. Cincinnati, one of those programs that was great at the group of 5 level, but just has not been able to get over the hump yet. Granted, they only had 1 year so far, but I also am not sold on Satterfield as the head coach of the future. I think, there have been some cries that he may be, canned, and I don't know. It's just not. I'm not in love with this roster. Even with Brendan Sorsby, I think he's an okay quarterback. It's just not. It's probably not going to be a good year for Cincinnati, if I'm going to be honest. Next up, let's talk about Colorado. Colorado, very, very intriguing story going into the season, especially going into last season. A lot of hype surrounding Coach Prime, Deion Sanders. How will he do? They had a huge upset to start off last season against the reigning runner-ups TCU. And they started off really hot and then fell off a cliff at the end of the season. A lot of their depth got hurt. And part of that came with really a porous offensive line. So one thing that Coach Prime did was he went into the portal and revamped that offensive line, got starters from across the board. So, a good job in the portal by Dion. Shedeur Sanders, his son, is going to be back at quarterback. You know, they got a couple backup quarterbacks as well. Worked on the trenches, so got some defensive line pieces, got some offensive line pieces, pieces from LSU, Houston, FIU, Indiana, UTEP. So that they did improve some of these pieces. They got an offensive lineman recruit as well, which should help. So Shedeur Sanders is going to be back with hopefully better protection. Dylan Edwards, who was a freshman running back that they had last year, very quick, very good player, good receiver out of the backfield. He's going to be back. And then Travis Hunter will be starting at both wide receiver and cornerback for them yet again. I know Colorado went 4-8 last year, and people were calling them overhyped. That's because the media really hyped them up at the start of the season because they were really intrigued by the story. If you look at anyone's predictions for Colorado going into the season, it was around that total. It was around 4 wins, 3 wins even. Because Dion was taking over an awful roster, tried to build it from the ground up. And for the most part, he has. But it'll be interesting to see how year 2 looks. And another little storyline to take note of, it's Colorado's first year back in the Big 12 since 2010. They were a member of the Big 12 beforehand. They're back. So should be interesting to see there. Now, Houston. It's year 1 for Willie Fritz. They went 4-8 last year. Their head coach, Dana Holgerson, was fired. Donovan Smith is most likely going to be back at quarterback. They did bring on Zion Chris from Louisiana, but it's still most likely going to be Donovan Smith's job to lose. And then they had a huge transfer portal class. Not any super notable names in the portal, but they did bring on a lot of guys. So the more people you can get in the building, the more people you can sort of test and try to fit in with your roster, the better. So should be a different Houston team. Whether or not they are a better Houston team, we'll see. Iowa State. It's year 9 for Matt Campbell. They went 7-6 last year. Rocco Becht will be back at quarterback. He was a pretty good quarterback his freshman year. Abu Sama, same thing, except for back as running back. They didn't have a huge portal class, but Matt Campbell historically does more with less. People had no expectations for Iowa State going into the year, and they really turned it around. So, a good job by them. Now, Kansas, the Jayhawks, year 4 for Lance Leipold. They went 9-4 last year. Jalen Daniels is back at quarterback. Devin Neal's back at running back. I guess my biggest question about Kansas right now is depth. Defense is still a little suspect, but every single year that Jalen Daniels has been playing, he's gotten hurt, and he's gotten hurt a lot. So can he stay healthy? And on top of that, who do they have behind him? It's one of those concerns that you don't want to think about, but if you're building up this roster, you have to think about it. Because for the past couple of years, you've had Jason Bean. And Jason Bean did okay in relief. He was a pretty good backup option. That being said, you don't have Jason Bean anymore. He graduated. Are you going to rely on Cole Ballard? You could. You'd have to hope he develops a little bit. Went one touchdown, three interceptions in his limited playing time. So, you know, I guess there's a lot of questions there for Kansas. Now let's talk about Kansas State. They also went 9-4 last year. It's year 6 for Chris Kleiman. It'll be a different quarterback for the Wildcats. Last year was Will Howard. He's going to be suiting up for the Buckeyes next year. So it'll be Avery Johnson's job. DJ Giddens is back at running back. And the receiver room is going to look a little bit different. Their top 2 receiving threats, Ben Sinnott and Phillip Brooks, both gone to the NFL draft and graduation. So they did bring in a wide receiver transfer, Dante Cephas from Penn State, but I don't know if that's enough to really fill up the wide receiver room. Going to have some guys step up as well. Now, TCU, it's year 3 for Sonny Dykes, 5-7 last year. And in his first year there, they had that immaculate run to the national championship game. It'll be Josh Hoover as the incumbent starting quarterback. Ken Seals from Vanderbilt will be competing for that job. And most of those positions really staying consistent on offense as well. So TCU should have a similar team to last year, but whether or not they improve will be seen. Now, Texas Tech, it's also year 3 for Joey McGuire. He went 7-6 last year. It'll be Baron Morton at quarterback again. He filled in for Tyler Shuck last year. Cameron Valdez back at running back. Their biggest transfer, at least transferring in to the program, was Josh Kelly, the wide receiver from Washington State. He's a good wide receiver, so should be a little better than they were last year. Texas Tech, one of those schools that is very competitive always. They find a way to just win games. Now, Utah, it's year 21 for Kyle Whittingham. He has been there for a long time. They went 8-5 last year, but that was with Bryson Barnes. Cam Rising is going to be back this year. Rising, in the years that he's played, has been fantastic in leading the Utes to success. He missed all of last year, rehabbing from a torn ACL in the 2023, well, it was technically early 2023, but it was for the 2022-2023 season. That Rose Bowl, where they lost to Penn State, he tore his ACL. Jalen Glover's going to be back at running back, and their biggest addition in the transfer portal was USC wide receiver Dorian Singer. Again, talented wide receiver. You pair him up with Cam Rising, should be pretty good. Now, West Virginia. Year 6 for Neil Brown, 9-4 last year. Going to have some consistency as well. Garrett Green back at quarterback. Jaheim White and CJ Donaldson both back to make up a solid running back room. And the receiver room gets a little boost. Jaden Bray from Oklahoma State will be joining that receiver room. So should be consistency or even improvement for West Virginia. They should be another solid team this year. And then finally, let's talk about Oklahoma State. They are the team that I'm wearing the jersey of today. It's year 20 for Mike Gundy, and 10-4 last year. They made it to the Big 12 championship game, lost to Texas. Your quarterback room will look a little too similar, and I want to see a little change up of pace. Alan Bowman will be back as quarterback for the Pokes this year. Just, I'm not a big Bowman believer. Uh, he's, he's still playing very inconsistent football where one week he looks adequate, not good, adequate, and then the next week he looks utterly terrible. So I want to see a little bit more from Garrett Rangel. He was just a freshman last year, so I want to see how they'll use him, if he'll get a little bit more playing time. They didn't add any quarterbacks in the portal. In fact, they didn't add much in the portal, only added one wide receiver coming over from, I believe, Virginia Tech, Dwayne Lofton. But yeah, they didn't add much in the transfer portal. So, Mike Gundy does know how to do a lot with a little, but again, it's much better to do to not have to rely on that and actually get the pieces that you want. But most importantly for Oklahoma State, Ollie Gordon II, their workhorse running back from last year, he's coming back, and he's really who their offense revolves around. So if Ollie Gordon keeps up that momentum, they should have a pretty good season. So that does it for the previews for the Big 12. Let's get into the predictions side of things, because we got a lot of predictions to do. And where I'm going to start off with these predictions is I'll start from the bottom and sort of work my way up. So I'm going to start with Cincinnati. I don't think Cincinnati is going to have a very good year. If you've seen some of the other predictions, you'll know that I don't think Cincinnati is going to have a good year. First 2 weeks, a win against Towson and a win hosting Pitt. I think those are fairly reasonable. Pitt, also a team that I predicted to struggle a lot. I had them going 3-9. So Cincinnati gets wins in weeks 1 and weeks 2. I don't think they get another win for the rest of the season. At Miami of Ohio, I think they'll get upset again. They lost that game last year. I think they'll lose that game this year. Lost to Houston. Lost at Texas Tech. Lost at UCF. Lost to Arizona State. Lost to Colorado. Lost to West Virginia. Lost to Iowa State. Lost to Kansas State. And lost to TCU. I think that's a tough schedule. And I see them going 2-10 and 0-9 in conference. Now, it's important to note, Big 12 has 9 conference games as opposed to the 8 that we've seen traditionally in other conferences. Pac-12 used to have 9 conference games as well. Pac-12 is no longer. So that's Cincinnati. Let's talk about BYU, or pardon me, let's talk about Houston next. Houston starts off week 1 against UNLV. I think they win that. I think they lose at Oklahoma, beat Rice, and beat Cincinnati on the road. So starting off 3-1, I think they get one more win late in the season against Baylor. But I think they'll lose to Iowa State. I think they lose at TCU, lose at Kansas, lose to Utah and Kansas State at home, lose at Arizona, and lose at BYU, going 4-8 and 2-7 in conference. I know Willie Fritz is a better coach than Dana Holgorsen. He doesn't have his guys in there yet. So with the roster where it is right now, I think it's fairly reasonable that they have the same record, even though they might play better. It's a tougher schedule. Whenever you draw Kansas, Kansas State, Utah, Arizona, Iowa State, these are good teams that they're playing. So it's unfortunate, but that's how I see it. Now, TCU, another team that record isn't really indicative of how well I think that they'll play. They start off at Stanford. I think they win that game. I think they beat LIU. I think they lose to UCF. And I think they beat SMU on the road. I think they lose at Kansas, beat Houston, and then go on a 5-game skid against Utah on the road, Texas Tech at home, Baylor at home, Oklahoma State at home, Arizona at home, and then beat Cincinnati on the road, finishing 5-7 and going 2-7 in conference. Now, talked about UCF. Let's go to UCF. I think they beat New Hampshire. I think they beat Sam Houston. I think they beat TCU on the road. I think they lose to Colorado, lose in the swamp against Florida. I think they beat Cincinnati, lose to Iowa State on the road, beat BYU before dropping the final 4 games against Arizona, at Arizona State, West Virginia, and Utah. So I see them going 5-7 and 3-6 in conference play. Now, for BYU, I see them going 5-7, 3-6 in conference as well, with wins coming against Southern Illinois, Wyoming on the road, UCF, Kansas, and Houston. I see them losing to SMU on the road, losing to Kansas State, losing at Baylor, losing to Arizona, losing to Oklahoma State, losing at Utah, and losing at Arizona State as well. And that will conclude the teams that I don't think will be bowl eligible. I think a decent chunk of this conference will at the very least make a bowl game. And one of those teams includes Baylor. Baylor starts off against Tarleton State. I think that's a victory. I see them losing at Utah before beating Air Force, beating Colorado on the road, beating BYU, and losing to Iowa State on the road. I see them beating Texas Tech on the road, losing to Oklahoma State, beating TCU before dropping their final 3 games against West Virginia on the road, Houston on the road, and Kansas. So I see them going 6-6 and 4-6 in conference. Now, you might be wondering, well, Zeke, you said that there was 9 conference games. How could Baylor go 4-6? Some teams, and I, for the life of me, do not know why, some of these teams are playing 10 conference games. Baylor, Arizona, Kansas State, and Utah are all playing 10 conference games. Why them? I don't know. But, looking at their schedule, their non-conference slate is just Tarleton State and Air Force. Utah's in the Big 12, Colorado's in the Big 12, BYU's in the Big 12, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, both in the Big 12, Texas Tech, TCU, both in the Big 12, West Virginia, Houston, Kansas, all of those schools are in the Big 12. So really, I'm only seeing two out of conference games on their schedule, which means that they have to have 10 conference games out of 12. I don't know why this is happening. I'm not sure, but that is the reality of the situation. Now, moving forward, let's talk about Texas Tech. I see them having a hot start to the season, beating Abilene Christian, beating Washington State, beating North Texas, beating Arizona State, and beating Cincinnati, starting off 5-0 before losing to Arizona on the road, beating Baylor, beating TCU, and then losing at Iowa State, losing to Colorado, losing at Oklahoma State, and losing to West Virginia, finishing 7-5, 4-5 in conference. And for Arizona State, I see them having a similar record. I see them also going 7-5 with 4-5 in conference. I see them beating Wyoming, beating Mississippi State, beating Texas State. Now that Mississippi State game is going to be in Tempe, so it should be, a different change of pace for the Bulldogs of Mississippi State. Going to be year one under Jeff Lebby for them, so it'll be a new team. Blake Shapen's going to be their starting quarterback. It's going to be different, and I think Arizona State would have the edge given the conditions. So starting off 3-0, then losing at Texas Tech before a bye week. I think they beat Kansas. I think they lose to Utah, beat Cincinnati before another bye week. I think they lose at Oklahoma State, beat UCF, lose at Kansas State, beat BYU before losing at Arizona in the Territorial Cup, finishing 7-5, 4-5 in conference. Now, let's talk about Kansas. Because there's been a couple games where, given what I've said about Kansas, you would think that Kansas would have won them. I think Kansas has a hot start to the season as well. Beating Lindenwood, beating Illinois on the road, beating UNLV, beating West Virginia on the road, beating TCU. I think they're a good team. I think at some point during the middle of the season, Jalen Daniels will get hurt. And you can say what you will. Again, these are my predictions. He's gotten hurt for multiple years now, and it's always during the middle of the season. So I think around the Arizona State game is when he'll get hurt, and I think Arizona State is better than their backup or their current backup right now. They don't have a Jason Bean to fill in. They have Cole Ballard. They don't have the same depth that they've had in seasons past. So what does that leave us? It leaves us with a loss against Arizona State. I think they are able to squeeze past Houston. I do. But I think they lose to Kansas State on the road. I think they lose to Iowa State. I think they lose at BYU, and I think they lose to Colorado. They might beat Baylor in the final week of the season because Jalen Daniels might be back by then. But I see them going 7-5, 4-5 in conference. And then Colorado. North Dakota State, I think that's a win to start off the season. I think they beat Nebraska on the road and beat Colorado State on the road. Nebraska still in that rebuild under Matt Rule. They went 5-7 last year, so they had a good first season there. But I don't know whether they're going to be starting Dylan Raiola. I don't know whether they're going to keep on rocking with Hunter Harburg or Heinrich Harburg. Double H, if you will. I just don't think that they have the roster in place with that same sort of consistency that they would want in order to beat Colorado. So I think Colorado starts off 3-0. I think they lose to Baylor, but I think they beat UCF. lose to Kansas State, lose at Arizona. I think they beat Cincinnati. I think they beat Texas Tech, lose to Utah, beat Kansas on the road, and lose to Oklahoma State. I think they go 7-5 in year two of Dion, 4-5 in conference. So a solid year for Colorado. Now, as we move forward, let's talk about West Virginia. The Mountaineers start off against Penn State. I think they lose that game. I think they beat UAlbany, beat Pitt in the backyard brawl. I think they lose to Kansas, lose at Oklahoma State. I think they beat Iowa State, beat Kansas State, lose at Arizona, beat Cincinnati on the road, beat Baylor, beat UCF, and beat Texas Tech on the road, going 8-4 and 6-3 in conference. Now let's get to the 9-win teams. Iowa State, North Dakota, I think they win that one. I think they lose at Iowa in the Cyhawk game. Iowa's offense will still be absolutely horrific, although they don't have Brian Ferentz anymore, so it might be a little better. But Deacon Hill is just awful. But their defense is just swarming. So I think that Iowa State will lose the Cyhawk game before they go on a little run here. Beating Arkansas State, beating Houston on the road, beating Baylor. I think they lose at West Virginia before beating UCF, beating Texas Tech, beating Kansas on the road, beating Cincinnati. I think they lose at Utah before they beat Kansas State in the final game of the season, going 9-3 and 7-2 in conference play. Now, speaking of Kansas State, I see Kansas State having another really good season under Avery Johnson. Beating UT Martin, beating Tulane on the road, beating Arizona, beating BYU on the road, beating Oklahoma State, beating Colorado on the road. I think they lose at West Virginia before they beat their rivals in Kansas, beat Houston on the road, beat Arizona State, beat Cincinnati. I think they lose at Iowa State to finish off the year 10-2, going 8-2 in conference. So a tough schedule, but they win against some quality opponents, win against Arizona, win against Oklahoma State. But I think they will drop at least one game in the late stretch of the season, potentially even two, and that'll cost them. Looking ahead maybe to the Sunflower Showdown against Kansas, the way the schedule works out, I think there's room for slip-ups there. Now, let's talk about Utah. They start off against Southern Utah. I think that they win that one. Then they play against Baylor. I think they win that one as well. Now it's where things get a little tricky. The Battle of the Brothers, Utah versus Utah State. I think Utah wins that one on the road. I think they lose at Oklahoma State, and I think they lose when hosting Arizona. So back-to-back losses. They're now 3-2. And Kyle Whittingham is in panic mode a little bit. They win at Arizona State, beat TCU, win at Houston, beat BYU, win at Colorado, beat Iowa State, and beat UCF, going 10-2, 8-2 in conference, which is a good year, a very good year. But, those two losses, I think, will really sort of sting for them. And now let's get to the two teams that I think will most likely play in the title game. First things first, Arizona. When you have a star wide receiver and a star QB that are as good as Noah Fafita and Tetroa McMillan, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. And obviously, they're going to take some time to gel with the new coaching staff. That's what the first couple weeks of the season are for. They beat New Mexico. They beat Northern Arizona. I think they lose at Kansas State before their bye week. I think they beat Utah on the road, beat Texas Tech. They get into a groove here. Beat BYU, beat Colorado, beat West Virginia, beat UCF on the road. I think they have, and then after their bye week, I think they beat Houston, I think they beat TCU, and I think they beat Arizona State, going 11-1, 9-1 in conference. I see them having a very, very solid season, a very good season. That being said, I could absolutely see the Utah result being flipped. West Virginia could be a little iffy, although West Virginia will have to travel to Arizona, to Tucson to play that game. So it's a pretty advantageous schedule for Arizona there. Really, only a handful of tough games. And then Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, their biggest obstacle in really asserting themselves in the Big 12 has always been the fact that they've been seen as a little brother to Oklahoma. In the Bedlam game, they would, typically have a pretty good season, maybe have a chance at making the Big 12 title, and then lose Bedlam. They don't have Bedlam this year. First year without Bedlam in God knows how long. I see Oklahoma State starting off the season against South Dakota State. I think they win that one. Snap South Dakota State's win streak. I see them beating Arkansas at home, beating Tulsa on the road, beating Utah at home. I see them losing at Kansas State. Kansas State wanting revenge for last year. Oklahoma State won that one in Boone Pickens Stadium. I see that being a loss. I see them beating West Virginia, beating BYU, beating Baylor on the road. BYU and Baylor both on the road. I see them beating Arizona State, beating TCU on the road, beating Texas Tech, and beating Colorado on the road to finish 11-1 and 8-1 in conference. So with that result, the title game would be Arizona and Oklahoma State, which I think is a very good title game. And two teams with only one loss, especially heading into a 12-team playoff era, you might have some representatives there. That will conclude the preview for the Big 12. If you agree with what I have to say, go drop a comment over at Zeke-ollege Football. So that is ZEKE.OLLEGEFOOTBALL on Instagram. Or if you feel so inclined and you're seeing this on the YouTube page, go ahead, drop a like, drop a follow, drop a comment for some engagement. I want to hear what you guys think. Do you agree with what I have to say? Do you think that my takes are crazy? I want to know what you guys are thinking. Are you enjoying the format of these episodes? I can switch that up if you guys aren't feeling it. So, the more feedback you give me, the better I can make this as a viewing experience, as a listening experience, as an overall experience. So just, feel free to drop a comment, drop some suggestions. If you want to see a video topic, you want to see my thoughts on a rivalry or a controversial topic. Now, there is still a video that I'm in the process of editing. Schoolwork is getting the best of me a little bit, so the editing is going to be a little bit slow on that one. It's a special episode where I'm talking about uniform rankings with my friend Trevor Morey. But I'm going to continue to work hard, put some content out for you guys, because I love talking about college football, and I love my Zeke-ollege Football fans. So with that being said, thank you so much for listening. Again, feel free to go over to the YouTube page if you feel so inclined. Drop a like, drop a follow on Instagram at ZEKE.OLE. Zeke-ollege Football. So Zeke.ollege Football over on Instagram, Zeke-ollege Football over on YouTube. And tell your friends. Word of mouth helps grow the channel as well. So thank you so much for listening, and have a safe rest of your afternoon.